October 1939. A war was starting in Europe. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks. Hitler was drawing lines on maps of France. And in a quiet office in Washington, D.C., a US Army major named Guy Drury sat down and did something no other army on earth was doing that autumn. He put on paper, in writing with a signature, that the brand new service rifle of the United States Army was wrong, not defective in one small way, not in need of a minor tune-up. Officially, institutionally, in the language ordnance officers reserved for admitting they had built something that did not work the way it was supposed to. The M1 rifle in production at Springfield Armory was the wrong version. 48,000 had already been built. All of them would have to come back, 3 years later, on a rainy night in the South Pacific, on an island most Americans could not find on a map. A young Japanese officer would look through the darkness at what he thought were American machine guns and realize he had been misinformed about the war he was fighting. This is a story about 2 mistakes. One was real, the other was imagined. The difference between how the United States Army treated them is why a Marine in a flooded foxhole on Guadalcanal could put 8 rounds of .30-06 into a tree line in the time it took a Japanese soldier to work the bolt on his Arisaka twice. It starts with a French-Canadian boy sweeping the floor of a Connecticut textile mill at the age of 10. His name at birth was John Cantius Garand. He was born on January 1, 1888, on a farm near Saint-Rémy, Quebec, one of 12 children. When his mother died in 1899, his father moved the family south into New England. Jean, who by then was writing his name as John, went to work in the textile mill in Jewett City, Connecticut. He learned English while sweeping floors. He attended exactly 1 more year of school. The man who would design the standard rifle of the American century stopped being a student at the age of 12. What he had instead was an obsession. A gun club near his family's house left target rifles at the Garand home between shooting matches. John taught himself to shoot. He apprenticed as a machinist at Brown & Sharp in Providence in 1909. He took correspondence courses in engineering at night. By 1917, when the War Department was buying light machine gun designs for the American Expeditionary Forces in France, the man without a high school education submitted plans the Army actually purchased. On November 4, 1919, he reported to work at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts as a consulting engineer. He would walk through those gates every working day for the next 34 years. His assignment, in the plain language the Ordnance Department preferred, was to design a self-loading infantry rifle to replace the bolt-action Springfield Model 1903. Nobody had ever built a successful one for a major army. The British had tried. The French had tried. The Germans were trying. The .30-06 cartridge, with its enormous chamber pressure, kept defeating every prototype. 15 years of trial and error followed, most of it invisible to the American public. Paid for on a civil service salary that never made John Garand a rich man, he patented the basic action in 1934. The US Army standardized the design on January 9, 1936, as the US rifle, caliber .30 M1. It was the first standard-issue semi-automatic infantry rifle in the history of warfare. Mass production began at Springfield in September 1937, 10 rifles per day, 945 in all of 1937. With Europe sliding toward war, the new American service rifle was crawling into existence at a pace that would have alarmed anyone who was paying attention. And then it began to go wrong. Garand's original design used a system called the gas trap. After the bullet left the barrel, expanding gas was caught between the muzzle and a screw-on metal cap, then redirected backward through a cylinder where it drove a piston that worked the action. It was elegant on paper. It worked in testing. But once the new weapon began seeing real field service, with troops at places like Fort Benning, a list of problems started showing up in reports. The screw holding the gas cylinder plug could loosen with sustained firing. When it loosened, the cylinder shifted out of alignment. A misaligned cylinder put a metal lip directly in the path of a bullet leaving the muzzle. On a handful of these early rifles, the bullet struck that lip and blew the entire gas cylinder off the front of the weapon. Carbon fouling in the trap was almost impossible to clean with a normal patch and rod. Veteran armorers later said that getting hardened carbon out sometimes required a chisel. The bayonet mount on that same cylinder was not as rigid as the infantry wanted. A man fixing his bayonet for a charge needed the blade locked tight, not wobbling on a screwed-on collar. These were not catastrophic problems. Most rifles fired thousands of rounds without incident, but the flaws were real, and they were the kind that compound in mud and heat and dust, under the neglect that combat imposes on equipment. Here is where the story turns. In 1939, with Poland already burning, most armies in history would have gone in one direction. Bury the report. Keep building. Ship what you have. Hope the flaw does not matter. The Germans had reliability problems with their G41 designs and kept building them. The Soviets had issues with their SVT-38 and kept building it. When a great war is starting, you do not stop the assembly line. The United States Army stopped the assembly line. On March 8, 1939, Major Guy Drury sat down at his desk in the office of the Chief of Ordnance and typed a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Marsh at Fort Benning, Georgia. The letter still exists in the Springfield Armory archives. It is one of the more remarkable documents in the institutional history of the American military, and it is almost entirely unknown outside the small community of M1 collectors and historians. Drury wrote about something he and John Garand had been quietly working on for months: a redesigned front end. The gas trap was out. In its place, Garand had developed a much simpler arrangement: a port drilled directly into the barrel near the muzzle, through which propellant gas would be channeled into a smaller cylinder to drive the operating rod. No screw-on cap, no false muzzle, no misalignment. The new system was easier to clean. It was stronger. It locked the bayonet to the barrel itself, and it could be manufactured faster than the old design. Drury told Marsh that the redesigned front end had been put through a 10,000-round test. The functioning, he wrote, was very good. On October 26, 1939, 53 days after German troops crossed into Poland, the US Army Ordnance Committee formally recommended that the gas trap be replaced. The flaw was now official, in writing, with a signature. Think about what that document actually was. The Army had a service rifle. The institution had spent more than a decade and a substantial slice of its peacetime weapons budget developing it. Springfield Armory was producing it. The Infantry Board had approved it. Soldiers on parade grounds from Fort Benning to the Philippines were drilling with it. And now, in October of 1939, the Ordnance Department put on paper that the version in production was the wrong version. Springfield began retooling. The drawings for the new front end were finalized on March 15, 1940, 21 months before Pearl Harbor. Delivery of the redesigned component began that June. The last gas trap M1 rolled off the assembly line in August 1940. The final tally, recorded by historian Bruce Canfield, was 48,116 rifles. Almost all of them were recalled. The flawed front ends were stripped off at depot-level facilities and replaced with the new design. Once the correction was in place, production climbed in a way that should have alarmed anyone watching the United States from Berlin or Tokyo. By January 10, 1941, still almost a year before Pearl Harbor, Springfield was finishing 600 rifles per day. At peak wartime output in January 1944, the Armory produced 122,000 rifles in 31 days, roughly 4,000 per day. 164 per hour, around the clock. Women working in the Women Ordnance Workers Program made up 43% of the Springfield workforce at peak. Winchester ran a parallel line in New Haven. Between the two factories, more than 4 million M1 Garands were built before the war ended, and every single one had the redesigned front end. This is the link in the causal chain that almost no documentary about the M1 ever bothers to explain. The actual mistake, the gas trap, was not what made the rifle feared in the Pacific. The gas trap was a piece of metal almost nobody outside Springfield Armory ever fired in combat. What made the weapon feared was the institutional honesty that recalled 48,000 units before the war began. October 13, 1942. Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. A young North Dakota soldier stepped off a landing craft into ankle-deep salt water and dragged a wooden crate up the beach. Inside were Garand rifles, oiled and packed in cosmoline. The Marines watching from the tree line had been on that island for 67 days. They had buried friends. They had eaten captured Japanese rice. They had killed Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's men at the Tenaru River, with bolt-action Springfields their fathers might have carried in the trenches of 1918. And when the first Marine saw what came out of that crate, his face did something the soldier never forgot. It was not gratitude. It was closer to envy. The Marine Corps had been offered the Garand back in 1940. The Corps ran its own tests that November, alongside the Pedersen, the Johnson, and a Winchester semi-automatic. The Marine Board's conclusion was cautious. Under favorable conditions, the M1 was superior to the Springfield. Under severe conditions, and amphibious operations were considered severe, the board was not ready to place it in the hands of Marines wading through salt water and crawling through coral. In March 1941, Time magazine ran a story under the headline Army Report on the Garand that quoted the Marine mud test directly. Dunked in light mud, the M1 stopped working. The Springfield kept firing. That was what every Marine who landed on Guadalcanal in August of 1942 had been told. The Army National Guard men who came ashore on October 13th were the 164th Infantry Regiment of the Americal Division. Farm boys from North Dakota. One of the officers landing with them that day was a young man named John B. George, a national-level rifle competitor before the war and the youngest person to win the Illinois State 1,000-yard championship. He would later publish a book called Shots Fired in Anger, one of the most carefully observed first-hand accounts of small arms combat from the Pacific. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history you want more of, take a moment to subscribe. We dig up the stories the textbooks never got around to telling. George's assessment of the M1, written from direct combat experience, was unambiguous. He called it probably the very best rifle of the war. The 8-round clip, he noted, gave the American soldier 3 more rounds than the Springfield's 5. And he wrote, simply, that 5 shots are not as good as 8. The Marines started pilfering Garands almost immediately. Soldiers of the 164th said later that if they put their rifle down and turned their back for a moment, a Marine arm would come out of the jungle and the weapon would disappear. The thefts became so widespread that when the 1st Marine Division shipped out of Guadalcanal in December, Army officers had to be posted at the embarkation points to confiscate every M1 being carried aboard by Marines. The Battle of Henderson Field began on the night of October 23, 1942. On October 25th, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutaki's 7th Army threw its main assault at the southern and eastern perimeter of the airfield. Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, held the southern sector with Springfields. The 164th, with its brand-new Garands, held the eastern flank, the ground the Japanese had to cross to reach the airfield. The Japanese infantry manuals captured later stated that American troops carried the bolt-action Springfield Model 1903. 5 rounds per magazine, perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. Plenty of time between bolt throws for a bayonet charge to close the gap. The doctrine had carried the Imperial Army from Mukden to Manila on exactly that assumption. What they ran into on the eastern perimeter of Henderson Field instead was a semi-automatic rifle firing 8 rounds of .3006 as fast as the trigger could be pulled. A single American squad with Garands put more lead into a tree line in 30 seconds than an entire Japanese platoon firing Arisakas. Post-war interrogations recorded the same reaction over and over, a belief at first that they were facing concealed machine guns. By dawn on October 26th, the Japanese ground offensive against Henderson Field was finished. The Imperial Army never made another major attempt to take the airfield. 2 days later, President Roosevelt told the New York Herald Tribune Forum that the turning point of the war appeared to have been reached, and then, almost immediately, a second mistake began to appear. Not a real one, an imagined one. Born in the same combat on the same nights, the M1 fed from an 8-round steel clip called an N block. When the 8th round fired, the action ejected the empty clip up and out of the receiver. Struck by an internal lever, the clip made a high, clear, metallic sound on the way out. A ping. Anyone who has fired a Garand on a quiet range remembers it. It is in Saving Private Ryan. It is in the Pacific. For a great many Americans, it is the auditory signature of the entire infantry war. Somewhere in the South Pacific, a legend was born about that sound. It has been told and retold for 80 years. A GI fires his 8 rounds. The empty clip ejects with its distinctive ping. A Japanese soldier nearby, trained to listen for the sound, recognizes the American weapon is empty. He leaps from cover and bayonets the helpless GI before he can reload. According to this story, the ping was the M1's fatal weakness, a built-in tell any attentive enemy could exploit. The legend has been investigated by Jonathan Ferguson at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, by the YouTube channel Bloke on the Range, by the Garand Collectors Association, which as early as the 1950s was interviewing American veterans about whether the sound had ever cost them their lives. The conclusion of every serious study is the same. As a tactical advantage to the enemy, the ping was almost entirely a myth. The reasons are not complicated. In a firefight, with .3006 rounds cracking, machine guns hammering, mortars dropping, men shouting, artillery in the middle distance, a small piece of stamped steel bouncing on jungle floor is buried under a wall of sound no human ear can filter out. Even if an enemy soldier could distinguish the noise and knew what it meant, the American in front of him was reloading in about 3 seconds and had 3 other Americans in foxholes within 20 feet of him. There is no captured Japanese training manual instructing soldiers to listen for the ping. There is no post-war interrogation in which a Japanese veteran describes using the tactic. And the Japanese field manuals captured during the war, remember, told Imperial Infantry that the Americans were still carrying Springfields. In the literal sense, a Japanese soldier in 1942 was not listening for a Garand ping because his training did not assume Americans had Garands, and yet the legend persists. Every documentary about the M1 devotes time to it. Many veterans, when asked, will say they used to be a little careful about firing their last round, not because they had documented evidence the Japanese were listening for it, but because, in the long paranoid quiet of jungle combat, a soldier counts every variable that might be against him. Here is what is worth pausing on. The first mistake, the gas trap, was a real flaw. The Army documented it, recalled 48,000 units, and fixed it before the war began. The second mistake, the ping, was an imagined flaw. Soldiers worried about it. Folklore amplified it. Movies preserved it. And yet the Army never tried to fix it. There was no project to redesign the N-block clip, no special order to muffle the ejection. The Army simply lived with it. Why? Because the difference between the two mistakes was the difference between a problem that mattered and a problem that did not. The gas trap actually broke rifles. The ping broke nothing. It frightened soldiers more than it ever killed them. The institution that had stopped a production line in 1939 to fix something genuinely wrong was also willing, in 1942 and 1943 and 1944, to ignore something that was not wrong at all. That is a kind of institutional discipline that does not get written about in the history of any other major army of the Second World War. The largest banzai charge of the war came on July 7, 1944, on Saipan. General Yoshitsugu Saito, knowing the battle was lost, gathered roughly 4,300 Japanese soldiers, walking wounded, and civilians. Many were unarmed. He ordered the charge directly into the US Army's 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment. The fight lasted 15 hours. The 105th lost close to 1,000 men killed and wounded. The Japanese force was effectively annihilated. Whatever the banzai charge had been at Shanghai, at Nanking, at Manila by July 1944, against American infantry, carrying the weapon that had been recalled and redesigned 5 years earlier, it was over on January 26, 1945, with the Battle of the Bulge winding down. Lieutenant General George S. Patton sat down and wrote a letter to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Ordnance. Patton was not a man given to flattery. In his opinion, he wrote, "The M1 rifle was the greatest battle implement ever devised. John Cantius Garand never made $1 in royalties from the rifle that bears his name." As a Springfield Armory civil servant, his patents were assigned to the United States government. A bill was introduced in Congress in the 1940s to award him a one-time payment of $100,000. It did not pass. He retired in 1953. The millionth M1 was presented to him on his last day at the Armory. He died in Springfield, Massachusetts, on February 16, 1974, at the age of 86. Between 4 and 5 million of his rifles were built. Many are still being fired today at the John C. Garand match at Camp Perry, Ohio. Competitive shooters putting 8 rounds of .30 dis-06 through actions designed by a French-Canadian boy who once swept floors at a Connecticut textile mill. Remember this, if nothing else. The men who fought with the M1 had names. The young soldier on the Guadalcanal beach, John George from Illinois, John Basilone from New Jersey. The rifle did not win the Pacific. They did. The weapon was what the United States Army managed to put in their hands by being honest, in 1939, about a mistake it had made. If your father or grandfather carried an M1 in the Pacific or in Europe or in Korea, tell his story in the comments. What unit? What island? What river? What town? The accounts that never made it into the history books are often the ones that matter most. And if you want more stories like this one, the ones history class in America somehow never got around to, subscribe and stay with us. We are excavating the history they tried to bury. The next one is already on the way.